Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here today. I want to thank some individuals in particular. Stella. And is Audrey here?
No, Audrey's gone.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. So the reason we're here today is Stella. So Stella and her friend Audrey wrote a letter to the principal last year and said, why aren't you having an alumni speaker series? So the principal passed along to me and said, I've given talks at alumni event series, and I love them. There's a great captive audience. They're well rested, they're alert, they're not ashamed, they're not afraid to ask any questions. So I know it's putting a lot of pressure on you, but you're a great audience. And so we developed this series, and really appreciate that you've stepped up and come in for this today and for the remainder of the series. So I have some prepared marks and I'll return to them, but I wanted to talk about, as a way of introduction, it'll seem a little odd at first, we had a strike on this campus of our food workers, and it dragged on for some time, and it was very complex. It looks like we may be at the end of this particular strike, although the issues that are involved linger, and we'll still have to work on them. During that strike period of time, I was involved in a couple of times, because every once in a while the principal goes away and I become the acting principal, and in his email he says, while I'm away, direct your remarks to the acting principal. So last week I was acting principal, and I got a lot of emails from students, from faculty saying, settle this strike, treat our food workers better, things like that. About a year ago, or maybe 6 months ago, before the strike began, the student group came to us and advocated on behalf of these workers. And for me, that was very heartwarming, that our students who do not have a lot of resources were feeling strongly about a group that weren't particularly well treated, or they felt weren't well treated in terms of compensation. And then they use the concept of a living wage. And don't worry, we'll get to it, Anne-Emanuelle, it's not all about me. And when I heard it, I realized, because my wife is a professional, she's a lawyer in a partner in a law firm. She does environmental and Aboriginal law. And we have a son, and we need help in our home, and we need help in the afternoon to look after our son after school. And so we have a nanny. And I realized we weren't paying our nanny the living wage. So I went home that night and said, I think we've got to change. And so from then on, we started paying her a living wage. And I thought, this is what's great about university. It's transformative. It transforms our students' lives, but it also transforms faculty, even administrators, who are sometimes seen as intransigent. We're moved by these things. And this past week, Anne-Emanuelle actually wrote to me in my capacity as acting principal, although I wasn't at the bargaining table. And the interesting thing in her email was, I've been using this strike in my IDS ... course. I can't remember the course code. And so she was bringing in a relevant, current local event into the classroom. And the students could weigh the various aspects of it within the context of the course that she was teaching. And I thought, isn't this the nature, the transformative nature of education, where we can take these things that are happening on campus, as controversial or as tense as they may be, and bring them in for our students to learn about and to transform their lives and their thinking. And we know the reason that you're here today is because you valued your education and the transformative nature of your education when you were a student, for those of you that are alumni. And not to put a lot of pressure on Anne-Emanuelle, but I'm anticipating today's lecture to also be transformative. Anne-Emanuelle is a professor in critical development studies at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and also social and behavioral health studies in the Dalalana School of Public Health, which is centered on the St. George campus. And she is one of a very few number of our faculty that have held a Canadian research chair, and hers was in international health, and it spanned the time 2000 2003 to 2013, and I notice we have another CRC chair at the back as well. A very small number of our faculty hold these, and they're very prestigious. And it's a reflection, the fact that it lasted that long, 2 terms, a reflection of her stature within the research community. And she explores, she's a historian by training, she explores the history, politics, and political economy of international global health. Her particular interests are in Latin American health and social justice movements, although of course today's talk, she's a great academic, so she quickly adapted what she did to the Canadian context. She's published a number of books, and she's highly regarded within her community. So I'm not going to go through all the wonderful accolades that I have in front of me here, because it's probably better to listen to her speak. So please join me in welcoming Anne-Emanuelle Birn.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for coming out on this gorgeous morning. Hope more to come. I just want to begin by acknowledging the sacred land on which UTSC operates. It has been a site of shared human activity for 15,000 years and is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. So today I want to turn to both the past and potentially the future of global health and Canada's role in global health. Although as a historian, I'm not much of a futurologist. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable. So what we'll do is walk through, and I hope you can see and hear me, just holler if you can't. We'll walk through what is global health. We'll look at the age of imperialism, look at some World War II and Cold War contextual factors, and think through Canada's role as altruistic, self-interested, or an amalgam perhaps. Then imagine the late 60s and particularly 70s into the 1980s as an era of new solidarity, and then turn to the more recent era of what we call neoliberal globalization and the vagaries of global health therein. And following, we'll look at the future, that is, quo vadis, what is on the agenda, if you will. And if we have time, I'll have a little bit of a quiz. Don't worry, it's not a tough one. All right, so just to get a sense, how many of you have heard of this term global health? Okay, so a handful of you. Now, it used to be called international health prior to that, tropical medicine or colonial health. So this is an arena that has a long history, and it's related to really the rise of the imperial era when European powers were interested in dominating, colonizing, occupying countries of the so-called tropics for profit, for profitable purposes, as well as to position themselves politically in the intra-European rivalries. Now, about 20 years ago, after the fall of the Cold War, the idea of international health kind of serving in the Cold War as a form of North-South aid started to shift. And some of this shift had to do with interest in equity, right? So the idea that there should be greater equity between the North and South, between and within countries of the global South. It was also linked to the phenomenon we call globalization, so the increasing economic, cultural, and to some extent political interconnectedness of countries across the world. Now, this is a very aspirational set of terms, this idea of shared problems and shared solutions across countries. So you might think of this in terms of the response to the SARS outbreak in Canada and in China, Southeast Asia, or in terms of the Ebola epidemic, which began in 2014, most recently in 3 countries in West Africa. But one of the issues has to do with this new term's lack of engagement with the real politics. So some folks from a critical vein, and this is where I place my own work, suggest that in some ways global health is a reiteration with a nice veneer, if you will, of the older international health, which institutionalized asymmetrical power between the countries of the global north, or at least some of the central, larger, more powerful ones. So there's a real question about whether global health going into the future will truly represent a solidarity-oriented arena in which the differences across and among countries in health outcomes, in the determinants of health, all of those factors that affect health, not just medical care, but housing conditions and employment conditions, as with our striking workers, and a whole range of environmental and other contextual factors, actually are able to be reformed and transformed, really, in order to improve health. So this is kind of the lay of the land. Are we dealing with business as usual in the international sphere of health, or is this a new era of global health? So I don't know if any of you read Babar as children. I'm half French, so I was subject to Babar growing up. If you don't recall, if you see here in the whoops, I can't get my pointer working. But in this right-hand side here, Baba and Celeste are two elephants captured off the coast of West Africa, enslaved into a circus and brought to France, and then they're quote-unquote rescued and civilized by this lady who in de Bruneuf's books is actually called the Old Lady, right? So you have the old lady teaching them to walk upright, wear clothes, eat with a fork and knife, and so on. And then she brings back European medicine to the African context. And we could spend the whole hour just analyzing this particular image because it evokes so much of the so-called civilizing mission of European colonialism. So first of all, the idea that power resides in the European, not in the local population. On another dimension, we have power in the guise of the medical personnel. So the patient must be supine. The patient must be subject to what the health personnel wants to do. Now, what you don't see in this image is that the elephants are sick, are injured, because they've been in a fight with the monkeys. And here it's a very, very clear allusion to African internecine warfare in between and among African colonies and groups and so on. And here the idea is that ill health in Africa is of the making of the local population, right? Europeans are only coming to rescue. They have nothing to do with the setting up of false borders, of creating particular alliances with some groups and not others, and so on. Now, you could say, well, this is simply a cartoon, a bande dessinée, a comic book, for children, and that it doesn't really matter. But of course, this is a way of inculcating in young populations this role, this mission of quote-unquote civilizing, or what was called after the Second World War, development, and the role of Europeans. Now, it used to be that medicine was considered kind of the kinder handmaiden of the political and military and occupation dimensions of international health. But in recent decades, scholars have shown how health itself served to aid and assist in the imperial enterprise, whether it was in recreating power dynamics, whether it was relying on foreign medications, as you can see here, as opposed to the local herbaria and local approaches, traditional medicine, whether it had to do with trying to show the superiority of European approaches. So again, we can spend hours and hours. I just want to snapshot this image so you get a sense of what a critical approach to the history of international and global health looks like. So where does Canada fit in? So Canada was not a large player in the, at least a direct player in the imperial enterprise because its occupation was mostly domestic. I referred to Indigenous groups here and the land on which we stand currently. Of course, there was internal colonialism, which arguably still exists today, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail now. But in terms of the international sphere, Canada was really responding to Britain's needs. So there was, to a certain extent, in the pre-World War II period, an opening to British colonial and American colonial needs. So the Faculty of Nursing downtown was training nurses sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation's international health efforts from all over Latin America and the Caribbean, for example. So that was one way in which Canada was involved. And another was through missionary work. And I want to highlight a couple of dimensions of this missionary work because they're actually quite interesting. One group of missionaries were Chinese Canadians, so immigrants from China who were Christian and wanted to go back to China and as physicians and both try to convert, if you will, proselytize, and offer medical care at the same time. So there were missions in southern China and Guangdong province, as well as in the west in Sichuan province on the part of Methodists. And it's quite interesting to see the way in which health and disease were portrayed in this early 20th century period. So diseases were considered to be sins, and as part of medical care, there would also be moral care and moral rehabilitation, if you will. And there's also another dimension, and that has to do with these Chinese immigrants needing in some way to justify their very immigration. So showing what they had gained and garnered being in Canada and then bringing that back to the Chinese context. Now, it's quite interesting as well to see the extent to which missionary work offered opportunities for women, women physicians, for example. So Jessie Mack, up here on the right, was working for decades in China and was actually the last missionary to leave. As well, there's a really interesting University of Toronto medical graduate, one of the first women to graduate, Mary Irwin, who married a Tamil man from Sri Lanka, Ceylon, as it was called at the time, and went to live in Colombo with him. And she was hoping to work as a missionary, but because of her unconventional marriage, she was rejected, and even though she was a fully qualified gynecologist, could not get work. And so she ended up becoming involved in a range of rural women's social work, education, health efforts, and so on, as well as opening up one of the first birth control clinics in the 1930s. Now, there's also an alternate strain of Canadian international involvement, and Norman Bethune is perhaps the most famous Canadian to have become an international solidarity health worker, if you will. Interestingly, he's far more known and celebrated in China than he is here in Canada, even at the University of Toronto, where he got his medical degree in 1916. And you can see there's a belated celebration of Bethune's life here on the right-hand side that was dedicated a few years ago, a statue downtown. But here we have a really interesting situation where he's actually portrayed in a completely depoliticized fashion. So Bethune had been trained as a physician, as I said, served in World War I, worked in Detroit for a few years, came down with tuberculosis, and was one of the first people to undergo thoracic surgery in order to become well treated and cured, if you will, for his ailment, for his tuberculosis. In 1935, he went to the USSR out of curiosity, as many people did in those days, thinking it was kind of a vision of the future, the way societies would be organized. And then after the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, he joined forces. The Canadian government, like the American and British, refused to take part when there was a coup against the democratically elected so-called Republican forces against centuries of monarchy. But there were large brigades of folks interested, and Norman Bethune helped to develop the Canadian blood transfusion service to treat people who were these international brigadistas who were joining in this Republican anti-fascist struggle against Franco's forces. He came back, raised attention and resources for what was going on in Spain, and in 1938 he joined Mao's forces in rural China in order to try and help that cause again through battlefield surgery. And unfortunately, he himself died of septicemia, probably because he cut his finger when he was in the middle of surgery and had this terrible infection. I just wanted to point out this again. You'll see I'm really interested in iconography from different eras, and you can see how differently even the Chinese see Bethune being portrayed. So on the left side, you have the revolutionary with his long mustache and so on, deep in contemplation. On the right-hand side, he's being portrayed in Canada as the medical professional without that revolutionary spirit. So it's interesting even to see how that's portrayed on stamps. Now, getting to a period with which some of you may be a little bit more familiar, starting with the Second World War, Canada turned to a more active role in the global sphere. And one of the ways it became engaged in global health was through the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, founded in 1943 after Churchill and Roosevelt had met up a couple of years before signing the Atlantic Charter, and actually even before the end of war, trying to chart peace. And one of the huge concerns were the 60 million plus refugees that had been displaced by war, both within Europe and in Asia, a number of refugees that had, until last year, had not been exceeded. And of course, last year, particularly with the Syrian crisis, we now have upwards of 65 million refugees and IDPs globally. This earlier period sought to provide aid and prevention of disease and pestilence, get folks back on the ground again, but also to rebuild economies, right? Ensure that agricultural and industrial production would be restored. Now, it's really interesting here. I don't know if you can see much of this, but this is one of the exports that Canada was involved in. So this is meat lunch exported to Czechoslovakia, as it was known at the time, also cod liver oil, soap, footwear, and so on. And UNRWA also became an opportunity for Canada to bring in refugees, although often, as with the case of the exports, very much oriented to the domestic economy. So there were shortages of labor in lumber mills, for example. So Baltic woodsmen were seen as an ideal labor force brought in, and many other groups came at that time. So again, 90% of the $12 million that UNRWA, that Canada committed to UNRWA, was actually spent domestically. This is one of the grand ironies of global or international health is that often it serves as a subsidy for domestic populations and groups. I'm going to see if I can show you a little bit of a film here, which was produced by the National Film Board here in Canada, and the idea was to rouse the public into supporting what had been really rarely supported in the past, which was international engagement. Oh, there we go.
War-torn country, the sounds of the last battle have faded away. And in the stillness that follows, another army is slowly and painfully growing. An army 60 million strong of sick and starving children. The ruin of the crippled cities of Europe is their training ground. Through the years of Nazi occupation, guile and deceit became their weapons. And now in peace, they see in all its darkness not goodwill and brotherly love, but the reality of the terrible fight for life. Hungry men are desperate men, especially when their children also are hungry. So said Director General Herbert Lehman of UNRWA, speaking of the efforts of Europeans to keep themselves and their families alive. But children do. More than 2/3 of the hospitals have been destroyed, and those that have been spared operate with shortages in surgical equipment and medicine. Alongside the too few available European medical workers, the Canadian, American, and British doctors and nurses of UNRWA are helping to undo the years of privation and undernourishment, so that Europe's children may one day run and play and laugh again.
And just one last clip.
Now, over the first obstacle, they are on the road to becoming healthy citizens of a new Europe. These are the little children of Europe. Thousands of them, with proper care today, will grow into good citizens of tomorrow's world. But the millions of others growing up in the midst of confusion and disease, from them the world can expect what? For they, the sick and starving army of today, will face our children tomorrow. Let us hope they meet as friends.
So you can see some of the imagery that was utilized and the very powerful metaphors in these kinds of films, and the extent to which this really served to rouse a Canadian public that otherwise had not been accustomed to lending their tax dollars, if you will, to such international endeavors beyond engaging in particularly Britain's wars. Now, after the Second World War, as many of you know, the World Health Organization was founded. What you might not know is that its first Director General was yet another U of T man, Brock Chisholm, who you see here on the left-hand side. Now, he was a psychiatrist. He had served in both the First and Second World Wars, and he was the medical director of the Canadian medical services during the Second World War, and became Deputy Director General of Health following the war. So was Canada picked, and was Brock Chisholm picked as the Director General because He was seen as the most qualified international health statesman. Absolutely not. Here, Canada is playing a little bit as a mild pacifier, if you will, between the rival powers of France, Britain, the United States, and so on, who all wanted to gain director generalship of this very powerful organization. The World Health Organization is it's part of the United Nations, but it's semi-autonomous. So, and runs, at least theoretically, democratically through its own World Health Assembly and so on. So quite a powerful entity, at least as it was designed in this post-war period. So Chisholm is placed there really as a, if you will, he's parked there as a placeholder. He was serving as the interim director and then became the first director. And his big rivals to the left was the famed Yugoslav Croatian hygienist Andrija Štampar, and to the right, Fred Soper, who was an American physician who worked for many decades for the Rockefeller Foundation, and after the Second World War became the director of the Pan American Sanitary Bureau, currently the Pan American Health Organization. Now, it turns out that Chisholm had more than placeholder aspirations. He was very keen, actually, to take on some of the social medicine ideas that Štampar had put forth. And he was also interested in birth control, and he was essentially forced out of office because he suggested that there should be some kind of research or program around birth control in India in this early independence era for India and the post-war era. So he was forced out, and one of Soper's deputies, a guy named Marcolino Candau from Brazil, was put in as, well, elected, but really placed as Director General and served for a stunning 20 years, so 4 terms. So you can see that this idea of allowing an independent thinker to be at the helm of the World Health Organization was highly problematic during the Cold War era. So just a quick reminder in terms of Cold War politics and the development context. And I have this provocative subtitle here, Canada as falsely altruistic or a moral middle power, and I'll let you contemplate that. So you see this whole range of programs for and around development in the post-World War II, early Cold War period. And the red ones I've highlighted are those that Canada was involved in and that had some health dimensions. So Marshall Plan for Europe, as well as the occupation of Japan, to rebuild those countries after the Second World War and ensure that they would be incorporated into global capitalism, remembering that the Second World War came on the heels of the Great Depression. One of the large concerns was that this could recur. So rebuilding, really in many ways, the biggest development projects ever were rebuilding France, Germany, and Japan. No other development project since then has compared. The US government's Point 4 plan, launched in 1949, the Green Revolution on the part of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Alliance for Progress, founded by the Kennedy administration after the Cuban Revolution, and so on. So what about Canada? Well, Canada did become involved in the Colombo Plan among Commonwealth countries, and in particular became quite active in South Asian countries, especially Sri Lanka. And we see that very much in our midst right here in Scarborough. Some of the migration happened in the post-war period. Of course, much of it happened during the Sri Lankan Civil War starting in the 1980s. So what Canada offered was mostly economic aid, wheat loans, and so on, but also some public health training and medical education. Canada also forged a role for itself on the global scene through peacekeeping efforts. So this began with the Suez Crisis. Lester Pearson, who was a diplomat and then later became prime minister, of course famed for this role. And it had health dimensions, of course, mine clearing. War is perhaps the greatest threat to human health, so we should think about peacekeeping as a health activity as much as it is a political activity. And Lester Pearson was also not just, as I tell my undergraduates, the guy who lent his name to our airport in Toronto, but also the mastermind behind this idea that 0.7% of the GNP of high-income countries should go to development aid. And as we'll see, this has been a very challenging, small as it is, a very challenging what shall I say, goal to reach. So I wanted to give you a bit of the flavor of some of the Canadian government documents of the time. So in 1950, you have at this Commonwealth meeting to set up the Colombo Plan, this notion of the government being aware of the urgency of at least making a start in improving the standard of living in such countries as India, Pakistan, Ceylon, Burma, Malaya, Indochina, Indonesia, and Thailand, if the spread of communism is to be prevented. And those are my highlights, but clearly a very central concern is fending off communism. And then on the other hand, by 1959, the Secretary of State for External Affairs saying, "We are accepted by all as a peace-loving nation. We have won friends by lending generous assistance to less developed nations," et cetera, et cetera. Even the communist states seem to regard us with less suspicion than they do most Western nations. So here you have a middle player negotiating on various fronts. Here, maybe I'll just skip through this aid from that's going on through the Colombo Plan. Just note that the social aid, far smaller than economic aid, much of it goes through bilateral agencies and multilateral agencies like the World Health Organization, and that the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth countries, were preferred over Francophonie French countries. And you know the saying, all politics are local. Well, this also plays out in terms of Canada's international development role. And the Canadian International Development Agency, founded only in 1968, and as we'll get to, was folded a few years ago. So let's move on into the 1960s. In 1967, Canada is still rather stingy, does not want to join, for example, the Pan American Health Organization because it would cost $500,000 a year, and really accepted the U.S. kind of Monroe Doctrine, Latin America is our territory. And of course, in this era, we have enormous social uprising and social dissent in Latin America, and the very hard hand of US-backed repression in countries from Argentina all the way up through Central America and Mexico. In 1967, just before CETA was founded, who would become his director, Maurice Strong, said, once again, under our bilateral aid program, Canada provides its assistance primarily in the form of Canadian goods and services. Right? So just as with the case of UNRWA, 90% of our bilateral aid budget spent in Canada and provides employment for Canadians. Even more important, though, is the fact that it enables Canadian goods and services to become known in the markets of the developing world, where the potential for future growth is so vast. So here, is this altruism, or is this really self-interest on the part of Canada's, as any bilateral donor, interest in international health and development? And by 1969, even actually justifying a lower level of foreign aid as being more advantageous for countries in development. I think I might skip over for now. Well, we'll see if we have time later. But what's so interesting by the 50s and 60s is that volunteer roles of individuals, physicians, language teachers, math teachers, and so on, ends up being far greater than the international health role of the federal government. So this is CUSO, the Canadian University Service Overseas Plan, which still exists, and many of our IDS students actually participate with CUSO in their international placements. So here you have a physician, a newly trained physician in the 1950s placed in Nigeria, who's reflecting on some of the challenges, and at the same time some of his reflections we might find quite cringeworthy these days, as he was disrespectful in some ways of the local context and culture. Okay, 68, Trudeau comes to power, and you have a real sea shift in Canadian international health and development involvement. This is one of my favorite stamps. This is for World Health Day, which just passed. It's on April 7th in 1972. This stamp was issued. Famously, Trudeau maintained relations with Fidel Castro, was very interested in the Cuban Revolution, and was actually very supportive of a range of left-wing efforts across Latin America, even as he placed a hard hand on activists and separatists in the context of Quebec and the Quebec uprisings in the late 1960s. So, for example, even though Canada had been invited to join the Pan American Health Organization in 1949, it's only under Trudeau in 71 that this invitation is actually accepted. There's enormous pressure by human rights groups in Canada to accept exiles from the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile after 1973. So the largest Chilean exile group, some 7,000 people, came and were accepted to Canada. So for the first time, Canada is really looking to Latin America beyond the British Commonwealth, Caribbean, English Caribbean locales. Very interesting, after Nicaragua, after the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Sandinista Revolution, Canada, even though the World Bank, USAID, and a whole range of other organizations pulled out, Canada maintained both its trade and its health and aid relationships. The IDRC, the International Development Research Center, was founded in 1970, and again serves as, it's a small agency, but serves or has served as an exception to the larger rule of self-interested foreign aid to really develop partnerships. And these, in recent years, these partnerships for research around issues like eco-health have to be initiated by researchers in the global south. So quite an enlightened policy that developed. Still, we might ask whether this was more symbolic than substantive, and aid to Africa and Asia was far larger. But let me just give you a few examples of this transformation. So we've got this stingy outsider shift to self-interested middle player. So with the Global Malaria Eradication Program launched in 1955, Canada only gave a one-time $100,000 contribution and then refused to have anything else done in relation to this program, but once again expressed some interest in, well, maybe we could buy some Canadian vehicles and donate them in kind, some insecticides produced in Canada. By the late 1960s, both the Department of Health, National Health and Welfare, and the Connaught Laboratories, again based here at the University of Toronto, pressured for at least vaccine for the smallpox campaign to be donated to WHO. And first, External Affairs said, no, this is too expensive. And then finally, they are convinced of the importance of participating in the global smallpox campaign, but again, only after extensive public support and some media outreach. So if you can see just on the beginnings of the Trudeau era, the only involvement or the largest involvement in Latin America and the Caribbean is actually in this British Caribbean, and then by well into the 1970s, you have a whole range of opportunities in the health arena: family planning, education, literacy, nutrition, training, disaster relief, and so on. A few other contributions from this era to the international, or now we call global health world, from Canada is the Healthy Cities movement. Anyone heard of Healthy Cities? A few of you. So founded right here in Toronto in 1984, and the idea that the local environment was absolutely the first place to start in terms of creating contexts that were conducive to good health and equitable health. And so Toronto started a whole range of efforts at improving environmental conditions, being responsive and responsible around multicultural health issues, and so on. And this really proliferated around the world. Some of the most interesting examples have been in Iran, in Tehran, and in Colombia, in Bogota. But arguably, Toronto failed at its efforts to create a healthy city. We can see that today with our debates over public transportation, and in many ways, if you will, the will of the people was overridden by commercial and economic interests in the city and also at the national level. Now, in 1986, Canada was home to this really interesting World Health Organization initiative called the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. Anyone heard of this? Again, very little known within Canada, and certainly not outside of public health circles. So the idea was, in many ways, to try to institutionalize a healthy cities approach, but not just at a municipal level, but really at a societal level. So the idea of creating supportive environments, both in terms of the natural and built environments, strengthening community action and participation so that these were not mandates coming up from above, but really engaged communities. The idea of developing personal skills and agency in making healthy choices in healthy contexts, reorienting health services to be far more preventive, consider underlying forces affecting health and not simply curative care after the fact, and ultimately building healthy public policy. So how public policy writ large could affect health, that is, actions far beyond the health sector, in the employment sector, environment sector, transportation, and so on. So now to our penultimate period, looking at neoliberal globalization and the vagaries of global health. So as many of you are familiar, starting in the 1980s under Reagan in the United States, Thatcher and Britain, there was really a war on the welfare state that coincided also with a debt crisis, a terrible debt crisis that unfolded first in Latin America and then affected much of the world. And the response of global financial institutions was to call on countries of the global south to tighten their belts. In particular, if you can imagine it, to cut social spending, education, health, and so on. So there's an impetus for all of these services to be privatized. This was without any kind of pilot study to see what might happen if you charged user fees, for example, if people were to go to a primary health care center. And this had absolutely disastrous results, with which the World Bank only recently admitted had these deleterious effects. Now, what happened to global health aid in the context of these structural adjustment loans and these crises across the world? Well, as we can see here, and this is more of a contemporary moment, there is actually only a handful of countries who have reached the target that Lester Pierce had set at 0.7% of the economy. These are the usual Scandinavian suspects, and more recently the UK. You can see here Canada still among the stingiest at between around 0.3, a little bit under 0.3% of GDP or GNP going to overseas development aid. Let's skip over this. And there's also a paradox of overseas development assistance in that on one level ODA has been stagnating. On another level, if you look at debt, which is this gray shaded area, if you look at remittances by immigrants back to their families and debt servicing, these are all far outshadowing overseas development assistance. And here I like to evoke a really powerful literary quote from Leo Tolstoy from the late 19th century, and see if I provoke some of you with it. I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I am very sorry for him and wish to ease his lot by all possible means, except by getting off his back. So think about that in the context of global aid. So for example, OECD countries, Canada included, spent a collective $239 billion on domestic farm subsidies and just $136 billion on development aid. So a cow getting $2.50 in subsidies per day, while a sub-Saharan African child getting 90 cents per year. And so for every dollar entering low and middle income countries from direct investment, remittances, and aid, $2 to $6 leave in illicit financial flows as well as debt servicing. So again, one of these realities of overseas development aid that much of the population isn't familiar with. So the long-term strategies around health and foreign policy include development, defense, market access, and diplomacy, and increasingly high-income countries link their development aid to foreign affairs or trade ministries, and that's exactly what happened in 2013 in Canada when the Canadian CEDA was collapsed into what is now Global Affairs Canada, much to the alarm of many folks working in this arena. So here you can see the official goals of US foreign aid. Sounds very aspirational: eliminating extreme poverty, advancing democracy and human rights, then you get to promoting trade and investment, improving global health security. So you have this self-interest evident. And on the Canadian side, again, enhancing commerce and stimulating sustainable growth, responding to humanitarian needs, promoting Canadian values, which are outlined as responsible business conduct. And then, quite interestingly, projection of Canadian legitimacy as a non-colonizer, despite the appalling record of treatment of Indigenous populations and soaring child poverty rates. So again, this term, Canadian values, if you look at Global Affairs Canada, is repeated, and I have it highlighted here, over and over again, what Canadian values are: freedom, democracy, democratic governance, human rights, and the rule of law. And I think it's really important to ask yourselves what this means actually in practice. Famously, Trudeau argued Canada is back although he seems to have many of the same buddies that his predecessor had on the global stage. What does Canada is Back mean in terms of health and development assistance? Well, last year, there was an international assistance review carried out by Global Affairs Canada with very large public input. It found that there was interest in gender equality, women and girls empowerment, human rights. But Canadians are far more compassionate and generous than the Canadian government. So overseas development assistance dropping from $5.6 billion in 2012 to $5.1 billion some 4 years later. And in our current budget that's just been released in the past month, according to a think tank called the MacLeod Group, it was disappointing, stingy, and I'm quoting here, and in some respects hypocritical, mainly recycling old commitments and failing to provide any new money despite public pressure. So some continuation of Harper policies, partnering with the mining industry, for example, and simply recommitting monies that were already approved, such as the fanfare around Trudeau's International Women's Day and announcement March 8th of supporting women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. Now, of course, in comparison to the larger madness south of the border, it sounds wonderful, but in reality, Canada's contribution to ODA is flat. It looks better than this guy's, but not very promising at all. And so here's some of the rhetoric from the area of improving health and rights of women and children. And I just want to take a few minutes before ending to mention some key players and challenges. So some of you may be familiar with Stephen Lewis, who was Canada's ambassador to the UN, and then the AIDS czar at the United Nations, for example, and his efforts around HIV. And while incredibly laudable, the kind of work that he's done and the attention that he's raised to the global AIDS problem, I hear from some Southern African colleagues that in some way they're troubled by this idea of yet another white savior from the north coming in and solving problems. And I realize this is controversial, but it's important to understand that the fairness and equity or lack thereof of the global political economy order is a far more important dimension of improving health than the generosity of such saviors. Interestingly, Michel Jean, who the former Governor General is now the president of La Francophonie, perhaps has a rather different perspective, having been a refugee from the Duvalier dictatorships in Haiti herself, and has been raising attention to Canada's need to participate more with Francophone countries. Here we have our current health minister, Jane Philpott, and she's with Margaret Chan, who's the Director General of the World Health Organization. Jane Philpott is actually also a U of T connection, and I'm actually quite proud to say she's a student of mine, former student of mine. So I can't tell you that this opens many doors for me in Ottawa, but still. And interestingly, Margaret Chan, who is just finishing up her second tour as Director General of WHO, from Hong Kong became well known as she managed the SARS crisis back in 2003, actually did her medical degree at Western here in Ontario. And when she was being proposed, the Chinese government at one point argued that perhaps she was a little bit too Canadian to represent the Chinese government. Okay, here's your quick quiz. Who said this? No child should die for want of medical attention. Anybody? Who said this? Castro, you got it. All right. I just want, I would be remiss in not mentioning global health at home, particularly as this new arena is very much focused not on north-south distinctions, disparities, inequalities, but also health inequity wherever it occurs. So as you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with its report in 2015 and uncovered some extraordinary statistics. For example, the odds of dying for children in the residential schools was 1 in 25, higher than the odds of dying for Canadian military forces in the Second World War. As you may know, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in largely church-run residential schools with notoriously high rates of tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, violent treatment, abominable living and nutritional conditions, and death rates up to 5 times those of the overall school-age population. And one of the things that the 2015 TRC was able to do is compile some of these death registries based on some burial records and verified 3,200 deaths at the school, but this probably just represents a small fraction of overall deaths due to the paucity of data. Now, this is not simply a phenomenon of the past. If we look at some of the most recent data from the prior census, in 2006, we see that non-Indigenous child poverty in blue is the lowest, status First Nations is the highest, and then in between Métis and other Indigenous groups have also extremely high child poverty. Now, this is not only an issue of Indigenous populations, but I would also want to mention the problems of ill health and inequitable health among racialized and immigrant populations. And here we can see it right from Toronto. So again, poverty, an enormous determinant of health. And if you look at this chart, and again, I'm sorry, my pointer is not working well, but the orange has 40 to 63% of child poverty rates, green just 5 to 14%. So you can see, if you want to imagine a map of immigrant and racialized populations here in Toronto, an almost exact fit. And here in Scarborough, for example, we have extremely high rates of child poverty and among the highest in the Parkview area. And just a final point before closing up, we tend to think about global health in terms of what positive activities we might take as a society in terms of making the world more equitable, ensuring that there are enough health and social services across the world, and so on. But in many ways, among the best activities we might engage in as Canadians is reining in corporate power globally. And I just want to give you 3 examples: asbestos, arms, and the mining sector. So if you look at asbestos, it was one of the worst carcinogens, an enormous cause of hundreds of millions of instances of ill health, lung cancer, and so on. Until 2012, Canada was the world's 2nd largest producer of chrysotile asbestos, which it claimed was different from other forms of asbestos, and exported 200,000 tons a year to India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and other countries. Only banned asbestos in December 2016 after years and years of struggle. Kathleen Ruff, who is one of the civil society organizers who worked with health professionals in Quebec and beyond actually gave a talk in my International and Global Health Issues course last fall, and a very powerful explanation of how big a struggle even this quite obvious carcinogen cause of so much ill health, how difficult this struggle was over decades to get a single substance banned. Arms. Now, the largest arms exporters in the world are, not coincidentally, the members of the UN Security Council. But that does not, China, Russia, the US, France, and Britain, that does not mean that we should rest here in Canada and say we don't have some kind of involvement, complicity in the global arms proliferation. So the last decent year for which there are data, 2012, $1 billion in military goods and technology, rifles, armored vehicles, small arms, missile guidance technology, and so on. But the data are incredibly shoddy. So anything going to the US is not counted as an arms export. So again, the groups such as Plowshares, who are calling for folks to withhold their taxes in a conscientious fashion until arms exports are taken under control and dealt with in an equitable fashion, I think is a group that we might think about as actually working for global health, because death is the ultimate unhealth, if you will. Mining. How many of you are familiar with the mining industry? Any of you? Few of you. So incredibly, 2/3 of all mining companies are headquartered in Canada. Now, this is no coincidence. We have among the most lax securities laws in the world. So that means that mining companies don't have to report much on their goings-on. And as well, it's very difficult for any violation of health and human rights happening overseas to be brought to a court here in Canada. We're just starting to see some cases related to Hudbay and operating in Guatemala, and the cases are coming up as we speak. Mining is one of the most nefarious industries. In the old days, the problem was really around occupational health, around coal mining, for example. These days, with robotics, the issues are much more around environmental health and contamination. Gold, for example, is an incredibly thirsty mineral. So 30 tons of water are depleted for every ounce of gold produced, and then double that, 50 to 70 tons of waste. So the toxic tailings from cyanide to acids, heavy metals, and so on are a terrible human hazard, lethal effects as well on livestock. There's been violence against activists, and abandoned mines that are never actually exploited also continue to have their detritus seeping into the local environment. This is also a very University of Toronto aimed issue, in part because the CEO of the largest mining company in the world, which is Barrick Gold, and the CEO being Peter Monk, gave some of money to start a School of Global Affairs, and many folks in Latin American studies and the development studies arenas have decided to pull out of that because it's simply untenable to have a donor, a living donor, who is involved, as you can see, in over 150 cases of human rights violations, donating money to the University of Toronto, and are simply accepting it without questions asked. There are huge effects on Indigenous communities, both within Canada and worldwide. 50% of gold mining, for example, is from Indigenous lands with dubious consent. And the UN called on Canada to better regulate and monitor mining. Now, just last week, there was an incredible development. The country of El Salvador, the first in the world to actually ban all metals mining, in part because 90% of its water sources are already contaminated, and it has a very small watershed remaining. So this idea of water over gold is actually what we would argue a great global health victory, even though it has nothing to do with doctors and healthcare services. So there are, if you will, some glimmers of hope. So let me just finish up. Some of you have seen, produced a couple of editions of a textbook of global health precisely for our students here on the UTSC campus. And this is an image of the students taking my more advanced course. And first of all, I just love the array of students, and you can see the Inukshuk just behind one student. And this is really a portrayal of Scarborough, of Toronto, and the world beyond. In many ways gives us hope for cooperation and collaboration. So students from Trinidad and the Anishinaabe Nation and Uganda, Vietnam, Pakistan, and so on, working together for a project. And so I like to leave it up to the students to harness imagination, drive, commitment, persistence, knowledge, and skills to bettering and transforming global health in solidarity with the struggles of billions of people. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for listening to that great lecture by Professor Birn. She, as well as the other speakers, agreed to stay for a question and answer session. So I'm opening up to you now to ask some questions of this great scholar. Yes, go ahead.
What do I do with this?
You're just talking to the public. Yep.
Easy as that, is it?
Apparently.
My name is Henrik Thalenhorst. I'm a geologist. I've been in the mining industry for a long time, as you might imagine. Thank you for what is really a very revealing lecture for somebody totally from the outside, and many very interesting and thought-provoking observations that were told this morning. That's great. I have a question and I have a comment. The question regards the ODA calculation. If I personally give $1,000 to the Canadian Red Cross to be used in the Ebola crisis, for argument's sake, does that $1,000 count as part of the ODA? If it does, then there's no further question. But if it is not, what would counting those contributions, the influence of those contributions, be on the overall effect or size of our overall Canadian contribution? I have no idea. I'm just asking.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and official development assistance, ODA, is exactly that, official government, bilateral or multilateral aid. So it does not include private donations to Red Cross and so on. That is actually quite difficult to track. There's no official mechanism, and you can see what's been donated to the Red Cross. You can go organize to MSF and so on. Those that are based in Canada might be able to clock the donations, but it might be very difficult to distinguish what's being spent domestically on the Red Cross as opposed to, for example, relief from the 2010 earthquake in Haiti.
And of course, there is a government proportion of that because I get a tax break.
That's right.
Right? So
that's right.
There's a feedback in there.
That's right.
And would it be fair to try to estimate that, to see whether just to see the order of magnitude, does it make a big difference or not?
It would make a difference, probably not a huge difference. What's much larger, as we looked at, are remittances, which are going directly back to family, from immigrants back to family members in home countries, whether that's you know,
And then, of
the
course,
Philippines or Kenya and so on. And that's a useful system, but not necessarily equitable either, because it's those families that are lucky enough that someone has been able to migrate and earns enough money in order to be able to send back. But there are certain countries, El Salvador being one of them, that actually survive on remittances. The international overseas aid makes a very small dent in the economy.
Thank you. The comment is on, as you might imagine, on mining. I don't know how many mines I have visited. I don't know how many mines you have visited either.
A few.
Perhaps not quite as many as
No,
I have.
certainly not.
It is my observation that there are bad apples. I'm not arguing that. But given that mining is one of the two main bases for civilization, the other being agriculture, we have to mine. We cannot, first of all, if everybody shut his mine down in every country, we go back to Stone Age. So if we have to mine sensibly and sustainably, obviously. And that has developed over the last decades, the understanding. We had terrible instances in Canada ourselves with abandoned mines. The Jameson project near Timmins is one of them, terrible. But that has changed. And what I felt when I listened to you was that your presentation was too one-sided. Biased, actually. Where outside of Canada, many locals are engaged in mining, as you know. And the environmental damage that these people do is much stronger, much than what the companies do. Companies are subject to oversight. And they have environmental departments, as you know. And they're trying to do the best given the circumstances of what's technologically possible. Mm-hmm. The question of cyanide is a non-issue if it's handled properly. It's an absolute non-issue, technically. Mm-hmm. Things do happen, as you know, and I'm not belittling those, but it's done properly. Cyanide is not an issue. Mm-hmm. Mercury is an issue mainly by the garimperos, not by mining mm-hmm. companies. Mm-hmm. So I think you should, I would ask you to examine what you said mm-hmm. and maybe put a little bit more credence to the efforts of the mining industry, the headquarters, the ones that are headquartered in Toronto anyway, and give that their due.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment, and I am certainly not an expert in the mining industry. That said, viewing it from a global health perspective as opposed to an economic perspective, I think is illuminating on a couple of levels. I've, for example, visited a gold mine, a junior exploration in El Salvador, in the El Dorado region, where cows were dying from ingesting water. There was end-stage renal disease, soaring rates of ESRD, which is quite unusual among young people. And so the water was tested actually back in both in the capital and back in Canada. And there was found to be enormous health damage caused by this exploration of a mine, which has, as we've seen, since been abandoned. On top of that, the local environmental activists have been targeted. Now, this has not been directly on, we can't really trace the connection to the mining company, but it is extremely worrisome, including there are 4 activists from this very small group who had been killed, and including an 8-month pregnant woman who was shot in the back. So that's just one issue. I've seen this from the context of health of local populations. Just two other points I want to highlight. One has to do with the rise of neoliberalism and deregulation. And in many countries, regulation has actually become much more lax in recent years. And I agree, it's not simply the Canadian mining companies, but local mining companies in whether we're talking about Chile, Tanzania, and so on. The issue here is that it's a profit-oriented industry where, in a corporate sector, maximizing profits is the fiduciary responsibility. If profits aren't maximized, right, there could be a shareholder lawsuit and so on. And so the balancing of protecting the health, right, and maximizing profits is where the problems set in. And one of the issues with the Canadian government's corporate social responsibility policy is that it's all voluntary. And it sounds great, right? We're going to commit to human rights and so on. But without the regulatory implementation arm that ensures that that happens, it's a problem. Even the free marketeer sine qua non, Milton Friedman, kind of the original Chicago boy, said about corporate social responsibility that it was like asking a building to be, an absurdity. It can't happen because of these fiduciary, these legal responsibilities of maximizing profits. So I think the issue is really between the regulating side and the profit-making dimension. And just one last issue: some metals are not that needed. I mean, we're now and other minerals. I mean, coal is now being phased out. We did used to run on coal energy across much of the world. There's still terrific coal mining accidents in Turkey and Russia and China and elsewhere where there's still a considerable reliance on coal. Gold is not one of the most useful minerals. It's very profitable, right? Jewelry, the gold standard, gold bricks in banks, but it is not as heavily used. And then just one last point, and then we should probably turn to other questions. The most mining-rich country, it's a Freudian slip, in the world is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has suffered more from war casualties since the Second World War of any other country in the world. 5 to 6 million people having died, and a large part of that is competition over mining resources. I'm not saying on the part of the mining companies, but local groups. And the Canadian industry has actually been berated by several United Nations missions that have said that Canada's mining companies ought to have stood up more to the multiple human rights violations. And currently, in every cell phone where you have coltan used, children mining coltan across the DRC. Again, it's not only the mining industry's fault, but I just would simply underscore the importance of regulation and heeding regulation and its enforcement.
Just a final comment on that. I object to the generalization of the individual bad apples. Yes, they exist, but I don't think your generalization is fair. Number two, if you look at the environmental standards of typical Canadian mining companies, take Barrick for example. They start a new project. They say, we will keep the local environmental rules in mind when we do the project, or the WHO prescriptions, whichever is higher, more stringent. Mm-hmm. The enforcement, obviously, is in part by the countries, not by the companies, by the countries. And I think you're missing some of the good things that are actually being introduced into the mining industry. So that's all I want to say.
I appreciate your comment.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is really, really good. Can everyone hear me? I ordinarily have a loud voice anyway. I really like the fact that you equated healthcare to moral care. And that sort of hit the spot with me because I look Indian, although I was not born in India, but I have the genes. I was actually born in Kenya, and we emigrated to Canada over 40 years ago, so I'm very much a Canadian, but my schooling started in Scotland, Canada, and recently my doctorate in UK. My name is Dr. Samir Masham, and in the United States as well. So I can see the global picture of what you're talking about. The thing that intrigues me, and I'm looking for your comment on this, is we're very quick when there's a crisis. We're quick to give money to the Red Cross, to the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, for example, pump our money there. But we're not creating the resiliency in healthcare that we need to create. Now, I know Rockefeller Foundation gave $1 million to create CHW workers in Sierra Leone, but we in Canada do not track where our government is actually spending the money. Should that be something that we as Canadians should ask as a civic engagement? Where is our money going? Is it going into resiliency of healthcare building? For example, in 2011, 24% of our medical graduates were international medical graduates. Are we creating a brain drain? And I wonder if giving money is great. I mean, 2% of GDP is what's been proposed internationally. But perhaps we should have a parallel body to say, perhaps time and knowledge, sharing of personal time and knowledge should equate to money as well. And I know I'm asking too many questions, but I really will be intrigued by what you think about that.
Yeah. So I ended up skipping over some material on the brain drain, for example, but this is an enormous problem where, as you say, 25% of physicians and a huge proportion of nurses have been trained overseas. And so it's not just, as the African ministers of health call it, brain robbery, right? It's not only brain robbery, but it's a cross-subsidy, right? It's a subsidy because it's very expensive to train medical workers, right? So these medical workers are being trained, whether it's nurses in the Philippines, physicians in South Africa, and so on, and then being used in Canada. So what we need, a great global health policy in this regard, would actually be funding medical schools in this country to train all the personnel, and nursing schools train all the personnel we need so as not to have to poach from other countries, right? So even Saskatchewan, right, which is the home of Canada's national health insurance, Medicare system, has fully 1/5 of its doctors actually trained in South Africa. Many more Canadians many young physicians don't want to serve in rural areas. Other countries, such as Mexico, have resolved this by actually requiring medical graduates to spend a few years serving in rural areas and urban underserved areas. This is a way in which Canadian domestic health policy could make a huge difference. In terms of health system strengthening, which you're referring to, again, an enormously important issue. And it certainly has been pointed out that in Sierra Leone and Guinea, and Liberia, at the heart of the Ebola outbreak a couple of years ago, these are 3 countries which with among the lowest human development indices in the world, and whose healthcare systems had been absolutely decimated since the 1980s, between or among a combination of civil wars, structural adjustment loans, and the larger atmosphere where it's very difficult to keep taxes in the country. There are countries that have enormous foreign direct investment, but also enormous illicit financial outflows, some of which is legal with companies, corporations, parking their profits in shelters so that they're not actually contributing to the national coffers. So it's this whole range of issues. Now, there is currently a push as part of the Sustainable Development Goals and this Rockefeller Foundation effort for what's called universal health coverage. And this sounds fantastic. I mean, what more could you want but everybody in a country to have coverage? The problem is that rather than following a Canadian public style system, it really means universal health coverage along more U.S. Lines, where there could be a patchwork, a mix of public and private provision, and even more or as worrisome because of this mix, people having health care insurance but only covering a circumscribed set of services. And so we also need to be very cautious of some of the nostrums, some of the prescriptions for the kinds of issues that you raise. But I would absolutely agree, and health systems strengthening has been all but ignored for several decades, with much more attention on very targeted disease control initiatives. Important, certainly, HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, but you can't care and confront these diseases in the absence of accessible, comprehensive healthcare systems, because eventually the donors will leave. Right? I don't know if that addressed your...
There was one question about how can we as Canadians civically
Yes.
engage and hold our parliament accountable?
Yes. Yes, well, as I mentioned, there was this international assistance review carried out last year, and we're seeing what the results of it will be. But we need to continue to put pressure. It's not, sometimes Canadians are not active enough in pushing their government. So, Chrétien didn't take us into the Iraq War, but took us into Afghanistan. We could debate the merits of that and so on. Same in the Vietnam War. There was supplies, but not actual combat troops and so on. But I think we need to ratchet up the expectations of our political leaders and ensure ongoing engagement. Now, whether that means pressuring an individual MP, a minister, the prime minister, or it means being involved in an NGO, a social movement. I think all of those approaches are important, but it's not simply good enough to wait for the ballot box and hope that all of the promises that are articulated in a campaign actually become policy.
I have a question. Two
Yeah.
more questions, maybe one here.
I just wanted to ask, how do you describe child poverty in Canada? So they don't get any food, they don't have any housing, they don't get any education. What is real description here in Canada?
Yeah, this is not my direct area of expertise, but it relates to a federal indicator of living with adequate resources. So it has to do with not having to skip meals, not be in fragile housing circumstances, not being more than a paycheck away from homelessness. So it may not be the kind of the most dire poverty that one might see elsewhere, although arguably conditions on reserves in the far north among Indigenous populations, in many cases, hundreds of communities on boil water advisories, inadequate housing, in many cases that looks much worse than in many low-income countries.
But you described in the Scarborough area. So which area is
well, it's much of Scarborough that actually has up to 50% child poverty rates according to the level that is set by the federal government. And interestingly, Canada was one of the first signatories to the 1991 Convention on the Rights of the Child, which calls for child poverty to be diminished or eliminated. And Canada's child poverty has actually worsened since the early 1990s. On the other hand, elder poverty has actually diminished quite a bit, and that works good, thanks to good public policy, transfers, redistribution of income, and so on in Canada, pension plan, the old age pension plans, and so on. What we don't have is something similar, like a family wage, a minimum living wage for people at the other end of the age scale.
I have a question right here.
I've had this great internal conflict ever since the Syrian refugee issue began, because I recognize that the Syrian refugees are in a very dire situation, and I'm quite happy to help them in any way that I can. But I kept thinking in the back of my mind, if we can mobilize so quickly to provide housing, food, education, health care for these people, why are there so many Indigenous people without clean water? Why is there child poverty in our inner cities? Do we not have a moral responsibility to help our own people first?
First or simultaneously, right? I agree. I don't know that it's a trade-off. I think, the riches in this country are more than enough for no child to live in poverty, to have every Indigenous person have decent housing and drinking water and so on. But at the same time, we have plenty of resources to play our part internationally with the refugee crisis. Now, ideally, that would happen through prevention, right? That would be the best situation. And it's a very complex, the Levant area in particularly is very politically complex and has roots back to the Iraq War, of course, and before. To the extent to which Canada could serve as a middle power and try and attenuate some of the more hot-headed reactions, I think is important. There's also the issue of climate change, which we haven't talked about at all in Canada's, at least until some recent commitments, fairly appalling record on commitments. Canada's the only country that actually signed on to the Kyoto Protocol and then pulled out. So one of the pressures in Syria has been shown to be a terrible several-year-long drought, right, that led to, in combination with increasing investment in agribusiness for export. So people were forced off the land, right, into cities. There was social unrest. There weren't enough social services and so on, and that helped spark internal unrest, right? So again, complex issues, but I completely agree. We need to have the moral urgency, right, to respond to inequity within the country as much as we do respond to urgencies outside. And you saw the appeal to, in terms of UNRWA in the World War II era. There was plenty of terrific, horrendous misery in Canada that was not addressed at the same time. So I agree with you.
One last question. Okay. But I think we probably need to bring this to a close. I suspect many of you have other commitments to get to. So I would like to, first of all, state that one of the things that we at the university like to provide for our students is a safe environment for discussion. But we never guarantee that it will be comfortable. And engaging in some of these issues can be uncomfortable as you wrestle. I mean, the Syrian question that was just asked is something that I've asked myself, and I work in Indigenous communities. You know, so we wrestle with these things, and I'm really grateful that you brought, Professor Birn, a number of issues to bear that we could wrestle with today. And as you say, I'm thrilled our students are getting the benefit of your education and your courses and in the programs, particularly in IDS. But I'm also grateful that you were able to address a different generation this morning. So please join me in thanking Professor Birn for her presentation today.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you so much.